did not have any of the stigmata of COVID that I would expect to see under the microscope.
So was he clinically symptomatic from your point of view?
I can't assess that because I didn't know Mr. Floyd when he was alive. To the best of my knowledge, he was generally healthy on May 25th before the events of that evening. I'm unaware that he was suffering from any acute COVID symptoms at that time.
You also know that Mr. Floyd had sickle cell trait. What can you tell us about that?
Sickle cell trait is carried by about 8% of Americans of African heritage. What it means is that one of the genes that codes for the beta chain of hemoglobin has an abnormal substitution in it. If you just have sickle cell trait, chances are you will go through life and never have any symptoms from it because you make plenty of normal hemoglobin. That's very different than sickle cell disease, which means that both of the genes have that gene substitution, and then you have sickle cell disease. People with sickle cell disease can get very severe anemia, they can have sickle cell crises, they're subject to a variety of infections and other complications. But Mr. Floyd didn't have that, he just had the one gene for sickle cell trait. I wouldn't even have known that, except that it happens that people who have sickle cell trait, when you take a biopsy of one of their tissues and put it in formaldehyde, which is what pathologists do with all tissue, the formaldehyde can cause cells to sickle as a post-mortem artifact. And so when I saw that on Mr. Floyd's slides, I immediately called the hospital lab and I said, do you have a peripheral blood smear for Mr. Floyd? And it turned out they had made a blood smear during his CPR. And so I had a pathologist who specializes in blood disorders look at the slide and confirm there was no evidence that Mr. Floyd was sickling on his peripheral smear during life. I did also have our lab then run a sickle cell quantitation, which means they actually quantify the abnormal hemoglobin in the blood. And sure enough, that came back with the exact number that would be consistent with Mr. Floyd having sickle cell trait. So it's really just a fluke that it got picked up at autopsy. In my opinion, it doesn't have anything to do with why he died.
All right. What about paraganglioma, a kind of tumor? I'll just ask you about the paraganglioma as to whether you found or concluded that it had anything to do with Mr. Floyd's death.
So the short answer is I don't feel Mr. Floyd's paraganglioma had anything to do with his death. What we're talking about is an incidental tumor that I happened to find in his pelvis during the autopsy. I did look at it under the microscope. The most likely diagnosis is a paraganglioma, but I have no reason to believe that had anything to do with Mr. Floyd's death.
Okay. So Dr. Baker, I want to switch and talk about the death certificate.
Okay.
So if we could pull up Exhibit 194. Well, first, I'd like to talk to you about the press release report.
Okay.
And ask you first, Dr. Baker, if you would just identify what this is for the record.
Yes, what you are looking at is the final press release my office put out once I had reached my conclusion as to the cause and manner of Mr. Floyd's death.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what it means to certify a death?
To certify death as a physician means that you fill in the decedent's cause of death and their manner of death. And if their manner of death is other than natural, then you also have to fill in the how injury occurred box on the death certificate. Death certificates are relatively standard in the United States. Most of what's on them is largely dictated by the Centers for Disease Control. They vary a little bit in appearance from state to state, but the core elements are pretty much the same in every jurisdiction. Most of what's on a death certificate is actually filled in by family members and the funeral director. So, what's the decedent's full name? Where were they born? What are the names of their parents? Did they ever serve in the armed forces? There's all kinds of things that are captured. The medical examiner's primary role, again, as I mentioned, is the cause of death, the manner of death, and the how injury occurred. Most death certificates in the United States are actually filled out by clinicians, meaning your primary care doctor that you see. That person fills out death certificates for their patients who die of routine natural conditions. Medical examiners get involved when the death appears to be from unnatural causes. In practice, we should be the only people that certify deaths where the manner is ever anything other than natural.
So doctor, if we could look at Exhibit 193. First, would you, for the record, tell us what this is?
Yeah, looks to be a actual state of Minnesota death certificate for Mr. George Floyd. These death certificates are actually produced by the state, not by the medical examiners. We simply fill in the parts we're responsible for. We push all of those data to the Minnesota Department of Health, and then the death certificate's issued by the state. And so that's why what you see here says state of Minnesota on the top. But the cause of death, the other contributing conditions, and the manner, that's what I'm responsible for, and that's right in the middle of your display.
Yeah, just want to zoom in on that and show it to the jury. I think this is pre-admitted, Your Honor. So if we look at the cause of death, immediate, underlying, other contributing conditions, this would be the section that you fill out then.
Correct.
So if we see here under manner of death, it indicates homicide. Tell us, what does homicide mean to you as a medical examiner?
So as a medical examiner, we applied the term homicide when the actions of other people were involved in an individual's death. It's one of 5 manners of death that we can choose from, the other 4 being accident, suicide, natural, or undetermined. Homicide in my world is a medical term. It's not a legal term. From a vital health and public statistics point of view, it's critical that medical examiners fill in a manner of death on every death certificate, because from a public health point of view, you want to know how many people committed suicide in your state, how many people died of accidents in a given year in your state. And so it's a key piece of public health data, but we don't use it as a legal term.
So we look at 918, correct? Dr. Baker, in front of you, Exhibit 918 is a list of manners of death, the ones you just talked to us about. Natural, accident, suicide, homicide, which I've highlighted because it's what you found in this instance, and then undetermined. Would you tell us from your point of view as a medical examiner, what does natural mean?
Natural means the person died exclusively of natural diseases.
Right, so an example of a natural disease might be a heart attack or a fatal arrhythmia as a primary cause of death.
Those are actually pretty vague terms. We're much more specific. So to your point, Counselor, arteriosclerotic heart disease causing a heart attack would be a natural cause of death. A ruptured brain aneurysm from long-standing untreated high blood pressure would be a natural cause of death. Metastatic lung cancer would be a natural cause of death. There's almost an infinite number of potential natural causes of death.
And if we look at accident as an accidental cause of death, is a drug overdose an example of what could be an accidental cause of death?
Most drug overdoses are accidental causes of death. Some are suicides. But yes, we do regard most drug overdoses, because we don't believe the person intended to die. We do regard those as accidents.
Mm-hmm. And we know what suicide is. Doctor, what does undetermined mean?
Undetermined means that despite the best efforts of law enforcement, the medical examiner's investigators, we simply never could pin down the circumstances under which the individual died. In any good medical examiner's office, you are going to have a small percentage of cases every year that go out undetermined in manner. Most of those, as it happens, are people who died of drug toxicity, and based on the drug levels, based on the person's known history, we just don't have enough data to know whether this was a suicide or an accident. And so if we don't know their intent, it's often undetermined. More dramatic but slightly less common example, you find a skeletonized body out in the woods. You have no idea why the person was there, how long they were there. There's very little left to work with, so you don't really know what happened. A case like that might go out undetermined as well. Again, much less common, but undetermined essentially means we never really did figure out the circumstances.
Now, in Mr. Floyd's case, you listed the immediate cause of death as cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression.
Correct.
What does cardiopulmonary arrest mean?
That's really just fancy medical lingo for the heart and the lungs stopped. The heart, no pulse, no breathing.
So with respect to the term complicating, am I right in the understanding that this term means occurring in the setting of?
Yes.
Or in other words, cardiopulmonary arrest occurring in the setting of law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression.
Correct.
So, Dr. Baker, can you tell us how it is physiologically that the subdural restraint and neck compression caused Mr. Floyd's death?
In my opinion, the physiology of what was going on with Mr. Floyd on the evening of May 25th is, you've already seen the photographs of his coronary arteries, so that you know he had very severe underlying heart disease. I don't know that we specifically got to it, counselor, but Mr. Floyd also had what we call hypertensive heart disease, meaning his heart weighed more than it should. So he has a heart that already needs more oxygen than a normal heart by virtue of its size, and it's limited in its ability to step up to provide more oxygen when there's demand because of the narrowing of his coronary arteries. Now, in the context of an altercation with other people that involves things like physical restraint, that involves things like being held to the ground, that involves things like the pain that you would incur from having your cheek up against the asphalt, an abrasion on your shoulder, those events are going to cause stress hormones to pour out into your body, specifically things like adrenaline. And what that adrenaline is going to do is it's going to ask your heart to beat faster. It's going to ask your body for more oxygen so that you can get through that altercation. And in my opinion, the law enforcement subdual restraint and the neck compression was just more than Mr. Floyd could take by virtue of those heart conditions.
So, Dr. Baker, just a point of clarification that frankly occurs to me as you were talking. As a forensic pathologist, it's not part of what you do within the four corners of your job to try to calculate what Mr. Floyd's either lung volumes or oxygen reserves or that sort of thing would have been, is it?
I think what you're getting at, counselor, is the sort of thing that I would defer to a pulmonologist. Those are obviously things we can't measure post-mortem in living people. Clearly those things are the purview of pulmonologists.
Right. So Dr. Baker, we did find from the toxicology amounts of fentanyl and methamphetamine in the results from the lab.
That is correct.
You didn't mention either fentanyl or meth in Mr. Floyd's system. You mentioned those, but you don't list either of them on the top line as causes of death. Why is that?
Well, the top line of the cause of death is really what you think is the most important thing that precipitated the death. Other things that you think played a role in the death but were not direct causes get relegated to what's known as the other significant conditions part of the death certificate. So the other significant conditions are things that played a role in the death but didn't directly cause the death. So, for example, Mr. Floyd's use of fentanyl did not cause the subdual or neck restraint. His heart disease did not cause the subdual or the neck restraint.
All right. So these are items that may have contributed but weren't the direct cause.
Correct.
No further questions, Dr. Baker.
Mr. Nelson. Sure.
We're going to take a 10-minute break.